I am so bad with names. I just can't help forgetting someone's name 5 seconds after they say it, and apparently neither can the thousands of parents that will buy their kids an Xbox One X this year. I mean, seriously, how can such a large company come up with such a confusing naming scheme? Microsoft had to have something better. Maybe they just forgot. I mean, it's pretty common. How do you think people name their children Michael? Video games are some of the most popular artistic works in the world right now. As much as video games have sort of been part of the, whole cultural zeitgeist for decades, new industries like VR, esports, and games journalism have turned an already huge form of media into its own full culture, containing thousands of communities within it. This has created an ultra-competitive gaming market, both for the makers of the software and the hardware. The big three gaming companies, despite housing the same overall market, are executing completely different strategies as the next generation approaches. Xbox is using its Game Pass to fundamentally change the way games are consumed as a whole, as well as adopting a subscription model for the console, which seems a little fishy. Like, I don't know if I want the credit bureaus knowing I play Uno on my Xbox, but whatever. PlayStation, on the other hand, just seems to be putting out exciting exclusives and making their console fucking huge. Like, look how big this shit is. But I digress. Today, I don't want to talk about these consoles and their enormous sizes. I want to talk about their names. More specifically, I'm going to look at the biggest consoles from each generation and review the jumbles of letters that they probably should have changed. The Atari 2600 was produced for 14 years, and throughout all of them, nobody at Atari thought about how awful the name was. The 2600 was the first of around 3 consoles produced by Atari that had the least creative person ever come up with a name. After being called the VCS for a couple years, it was renamed to the 2600 to coincide with the release of the 5200. The 5200 was then replaced with the 7800, which is essentially a full-blown sequel to the 2600. I want to die. But this begs the question of why do the name change when the only reason for it was to make room for the 5200, which couldn't even play the same games and was discontinued after only 2 years on the fucking market. I need therapy. The NES and the SNES are some of the most iconic video game consoles of all time, and it's pretty easy to see why. These names are spectacular, and let me explain why. For one, the NES and SNES abbreviations are iconic and contain some of the best fucking letters in the alphabet, like N, E, both strong contenders. Not to mention the equally wonderful name of the Famicom and Super Famicom, which are also super iconic. This is how you make a sequel. A clear, concise name that shows its relation to its predecessor without being confusing to consumers. Cough cough, Xbox Series X and Wii U. The SEGA Master System was not a great console. While it saw some success in PAL regions, specifically Brazil, and had a couple decent games, it was just completely overshadowed by its younger brother. Fun fact, the Master System was actually based off the Japanese SEGA Mark III, which A, badass name, and B, it looks like this, which is equally badass. Master System sounds kinda cool, but much like the NES, the choice to put system in the name kinda rubs me the wrong way, and while the NES is just a really, really iconic name, the Master System just kinda isn't. However, the real star of the show was, of course, the Sega Genesis, which was the real first big success for Sega in the hardware space. The Genesis is a pretty decent name that showed how much more cool this was than the Famicom or NES. However, it was also called the Mega Drive in Japan, which sounds like a fucking transformer, so you know I gotta give this a 10 out of 10. You may have noticed that I've been pretty inconsistent with actually giving consoles a score. What you didn't know is that's also how I like to format my videos, which is why it's time to talk about the handhelds. The Atari Lynx is actually a pretty nice name that fits with the overall theme of the Atari Jaguar. It doesn't help that the Jaguar came out 4 years later, but oh well. The Game Gear was fucking awesome, man. It was, in my opinion, the first real portable way to play console games, and it had a stellar name. I mean, I love alliteration more than I love sex. The Game Boy and its successor are some of the most iconic pieces of video game history. But come on, the name is pretty weird. Like, it sounds normal now, but you have to admit that a Game Boy probably wasn't the best name they could come up with. The DS kind of sounds like a code name because it is, but it's overall very serviceable. And the 3DS is a pretty cute name for a sequel, and if you make me talk about any of the revisions, I will fucking jump into the goddamn ocean. Okay, now that we're done with the handhelds, we can move on to the PlayStation, which, if I'm being honest, hasn't had the best track record in regards to creative names. Oh god. Oh no, I forgot about the PS Vita. The PS Vita is great. Anyway, despite having great and unique branding, if I had to review the names themselves, I would probably say it's fine. The N64 was a magical console that achieved something that was pretty unprecedented at the time. The way it could display real 3D graphics was insane at the time. But why did they make the name a tech spec? Like, I see what they were going for by incorporating Nintendo into the name, but if you go to the store and ask for a 64, they'll probably just hand you far too much milk. The SEGA Saturn and Dreamcast have some of the most whimsical, fun names of any video game consoles I've ever seen. Too bad they were both commercial failures. The Saturn and its branding was pretty good, but what I found really cool was the overall space theme they had going with like the code names and the internal such. Fun fact, the president of SEGA America actually referred to the Saturn as a stillbirth, which is disgusting, but also probably the nicest thing anyone's ever said about the Saturn. The horrendous failure of this console led to the development of the Dreamcast, which, despite being a great console, could not save SEGA from the pain caused by its predecessor. The Dreamcast was a fun, creative, and completely different console from its competition. Its branding just screamed childlike wonder. The Dreamcast and its library of games like Jet Set Radio, Shenmue, Crazy Taxi, and so many more ambitious and innovative titles, but it all boils down to that name. Easily the best of any SEGA console. One of SEGA's strategies for the Dreamcast was to make game development super easy. They achieved this by partnering with Microsoft to essentially run a modified version of Windows on the console. This meant that developers could take full advantage of DirectX, which would make it easier for devs to take full advantage of the console's hardware and decrease overall development time. This ended up being such a great idea that Microsoft took it and used it to create their own console. Now, what do you think Microsoft, the least creative company in the world, would call their DirectX system? What the fuck, Microsoft? When Microsoft was developing the Xbox, the name Xbox was actually despised by the development team. However, since it performed well in focus groups, it was actually decided to become the final name. This is kind of like if I wanted to name a child Thomas, and then for some reason the hospital just wrote Xbox instead. I think even for people who like the Xbox, the name just, it's not that great. Like the Famicom, PlayStation, and Sega Saturn sound like advanced pieces of technology. The Xbox sounds like I would order it at Taco Bell and get a free Baja Blast with it. The GameCube is one of my favorite Nintendo consoles. It just had so much personality. The NES and the SNES were both super iconic, but also just kind of generic at the same time. And while the N64 had more personality, the GameCube just has such a distinct identity. From the games like Luigi's Mansion and Chibi Robo, to the name, to the fact that it had a fucking handle. This is such an interesting little cube. The only thing that really ticks me out about the GameCube is that while it was abbreviated as NGC in Japan, standing of course for Nintendo GameCube, some jackass decided to call it GCN in the West. What the fuck, Nintendo? If I was just basing my ratings off the amount of unique letters, then the Wii would probably be in dead last. Nintendo created the Wii as a way to expand their market to those less familiar with video games, as well as those one-syllable word lovers out there. Wii really is a very simple name, but it did have some utility to it. For one, it wouldn't have to be translated into other languages, which could hopefully increase sales in other regions. The Wii was also less associated with video games as a whole, which meant it could be marketed to families and such. Compared to like the Xbox and PlayStation, the Wii is a lot less gamery of a name, if you get what I'm saying. But honestly, even though I love the Wii so much, it just did not have the same overall quirky charm as the GameCube, in my opinion. The Wii U was a branding disaster. It tried to be a sequel to the Wii, but just adding a U didn't signify anything about what the console actually was. The thing with the Wii was that the marketing was so good that everybody associated the Wii with motion controls and such. But with the Wii U, no one knew how it was related to the Wii, what the gimmick was, and whether it was even a sequel at all. This is almost as bad as if I named my kid Grandpa. The Xbox 360 is a pretty good name, but it doesn't really mean anything. Like, I guess it could mean that the games give you a full 360 degrees of motion, but that's not really different from the original Xbox. I also think that the 360 name could do a good job of showing how this is more than a gaming console. Like, this was the first generation where you could watch Netflix and Hulu and YouTube, which turned this Xbox into more of an all-encompassing media center. In reality, it was probably just called the 360 instead of the Xbox 2, because then it would have sounded inferior to the PS3. Which, if you apply that same logic, then the Xbox One is probably the worst name ever. The Xbox One is very similar to the 360, with it being sort of a full entertainment hub as opposed to just a gaming console. It's one place for all media, which is an okay idea, but just not a great name. This console came out around the time that the One was really trendy, but it was a bit off-putting. Xbox's push to appeal to non-gamers this generation, especially at like E3 2013, was really apparent in the naming, which gives it a bit of a bad reputation. The Switch is the most recent console from Nintendo. It has a pretty banging name. It relates to the main feature of the console without indulging in the gimmick. It's super simple, and overall, it's just a really good name. My only complaint is that it lacks a bit of personality. It feels a bit too modern, I guess. Even the Wii had a lot of creativity and charm in its name, and in my opinion, the Switch just isn't quite there. However, it's a great system with a totally serviceable name. Unlike the Series X and S, they're not even out yet, but the names still look so very bad. The fact that they used the exact same letters from the previous console seems like such an obvious oversight that it shocks me that Microsoft would even consider doing this. Even ignoring the confusion Microsoft is causing here, the names are still terrible. Every time someone refers to these consoles, they have to say Xbox Series X and S, which is way too long of a name. If they just called it the Xbox Infinite X and X, then you could refer to them both as the Xbox Infinite, but of course Microsoft can't bother to create clear branding. But maybe they're kind of doing it on purpose. Maybe it's just a ploy to get people to pay attention to Xbox. And if so, then I think that's kind of sad. Games are art, but so are the consoles themselves, and by extension, the names are art. So for us to lose the art of the console name is something quite sad.
Please subscribe to Patty.io, he owes me money, and as always, comment your favorite soup.
Positive motivating force within my life. Never feel the need to wonder why. Let me know. Let me know. Love. This is awesome. Love.